Okay, perfect. Well, Molly, thank you for the introduction and for organizing this. And I also want to thank Ronnie McGinnis and David Haddad for inviting me to give this presentation. And it's quite an honor to be able to give the inaugural webinar, and I hope it turns out well. So when they asked me to do this, they also asked that I start off by telling a little bit about Southwest Research Institute. I know that a number of people are quite familiar with the Institute and others not so familiar. So the first few slides, I'm just going to introduce Southwest Research Institute a little bit, where we work, and then I'm going to be going through a summary of investigations of faulting and fracturing in the Austin Chalk that we've been doing at Southwest Research really over the last decade or so. A lot of this work is published in several papers that have come out in the last 3 or 4 years, and so this is a little bit of a survey of the technical work, and I'm hoping something will strike your fancy among all this material. And if you're interested in reprints of any of the articles or anything like that, just let me know after the presentation. Well, I work at Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio, Texas, and the Institute was founded in 1947 by a man named Tom Slick, and he was an entrepreneur and a businessman and an inventor and an explorer. And his father, you may have some knowledge of, he was called Thomas Baker Slick Sr., and he was a wildcatter and discovered the Cushing oil field in 1912, which was the largest oil field in Oklahoma at the time. And Tom Jr. inherited some of the family fortune and really was quite a philanthropist. And in 1947, he set up Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio as a nonprofit organization to be independent, for the betterment of mankind, to develop and to transfer technology. He set it up on the site of what he had called the SR Ranch. He bought several ranches and put them together into a larger ranch. He bred the first Barangas cattle here. He named the ranch SR for scientific research, and then later set up the Southwest Research Institute here. At the time, it had fewer than 20 employees, and its budget less than $100,000. And we've just grown from there. We now have nearly 3,000 employees. You can see the campus has grown dramatically. We now have 9 technical divisions that do things from automotive testing and fuels and lubricants testing to space science. We are the lead on the mission to Pluto that's still active. We were the lead on the Cassini mission to Saturn and the Juno mission to Jupiter, and we have other missions coming up. So a huge spectrum of activities. Our president likes to say we do everything from deep sea to deep space and everything in between. As a geologist, I think it ought to be from the core of the Earth to the ends of the universe, or something that includes all the geology below the seafloor, but we can discuss that later. Our revenue in 2020 was remarkably the highest it's ever been at $696 million. We still have about a 2 square mile campus with 2.3 million square feet of lab and office space, 1,300 patents. We've won 45 R&D 100 awards over the years, and we do, as you can see from the pie diagram, a really robust mix of commercial work and as well as government work. And this has been hovering pretty close to 50-50 between government and commercial work in the recent years. The work we've done at the Institute, the work that's relevant to the current project and presentation here, is really in the area of structural geology and geomechanics. And we've built up and continued for several decades now a really strong, robust program where we do basic structural geology type work, outcrop and subsurface work from the micro scale to wellbore and regional scale. We do a lot of stress analysis. We developed the software 3D Stress, patented or copyrighted it back in the mid-1990s, won an R&D 100 award for it in 1998. We also do a lot of geomechanical modeling, 2D and 3D, natural deformation, as well as hydraulic fracturing. And Kevin Smart leads most of this work, and we've done a lot of this work focused on natural hydraulic induced hydraulic fracturing in the recent years for unconventional reservoirs. We've also got a very fine physical analog modeling lab, and have run models of all sorts for clients and published quite a few of these studies. We've also done training programs where we did analog modeling as to watch normal fault systems, for example, grow, that we could then help exploration and production geoscientists understand fault networks better. We also have got a new capability doing drone-based photogrammetry. Adam Kaywood joined our team about a year ago from University of Aberdeen with a PhD, and in fact, we were out at Canyon Lake Gorge yesterday, field checking some of the analysis that he's been doing through an internal research project, and we're really excited about that work and in leveraging that technology to do quantitative structural geology. We do a lot of training, as Molly hinted at, and we also have done a number of joint industry projects. We have one active right now, and we have a couple more in the planning phases. The first consortium that we did in the geosciences was the Carbonate Fault Project. That's been completed. That was focused on Canyon Lake Gorge. We did an Eagle Ford consortium with 11 client companies. We now have our Permian Basin consortium in its second phase, and then we are also in the planning phases for an Austin Chalk consortium, as well as a drone photogrammetry and virtual outcrop quantitative analysis consortium project that we're contemplating and interested in talking with clients about. Our training courses started with an extensional tectonics and normal faulting field seminar that we first ran in 1997, and we have continued to run it every year, typically, sometimes several times a year for different companies. That's normally a week-long trip. We also have field trips that are as short as a day, like we do one-day field trips to the Hidden Valley Fault Zone and Canyon Lake Gorge, and companies will come over from Houston just for the day and be back home that night. Mechanical stratigraphy and faulting and fracturing across Central and West Texas. We do courses of different durations, Eagle Ford and Austin Chalk seminars, Permian Basin field seminars, fracture stress and geomechanics classroom seminars, and then we've recently developed an Arbuckle and Wichita Mountains field seminar. So we'd be happy to talk with any of you about any of those if you're interested in learning more. In summary, though, we do a mix of work. We do mostly, I would say, proprietary technical projects, but we also do a large component of field and classroom training. A couple of years ago, during the better industry times, we were spending on the order of 25 to 30 man weeks in the field doing training for companies each year, and so we've got a really robust training capability. And then we also do these multi-client technical projects. Our mission statement, which I just love, is benefiting government, industry, and the public through innovative science and technology. And I think we really enjoy pursuing all the aspects of that, working for different clients and the good of the public and innovating. And it's been a really exciting place to work. I can't believe that I've been there almost 28 years now. It's been a blast. All right, well, there you have it, a little bit about Southwest Research Institute, and skewed by my perspective, of course. Now we're going to go into a presentation of some of our investigations of faulting and fracturing in the Austin Chalk. As I said, we have published several papers on this in the last few years. I'd be glad to send reprints if you send me an email afterward. The work that I'm presenting was done by a team, though. We've had a really solid team over the years. Kevin Smart, still part of the team, we're still very active on all these projects. Adam Kaywood, as I said, has just joined us. Alan Morris is still working with us, but retired about a year ago. Ronnie McGinnis worked with us. I call him a short timer because he only worked with us for 15 years, but he got an offer he couldn't refuse from EOG and left us, but it was a huge contributor to a lot of his work when it was happening in the field. Kurt Gulliver and Zach Sickman, we had as junior geologists that were in between undergraduate and graduate school. And then Dan Lehrman is a professor at Trinity University, and Mark Evans, a professor at Central Connecticut State University, and they're all key members of this project. Well, the Austin Chalk, just a few, general observations. It's Cretaceous in age. A lot of you know that. Some of you internationally maybe don't know that, but it's a very important chalk reservoir. It's been exploited over the years as a fractured reservoir. It is mechanically layered and it is naturally deformed. So those natural fractures were key storage and productivity, permeability during a lot of drilling activity back in the 1980s. Austin chalk hydrocarbons are often thought of as being externally sourced by the directly underlying Eagle Ford Formation, which now is a huge self-sourced so-called shale reservoir in South Texas. But the Austin is also thought by some to be self-sourced, or to some extent self-sourced. And it's a carbonate lithology. It tends to have sapropellic organic matter, which tends to be important in terms of generating oil rather than gas. And so some think of the Austin chalk today as more of a self-sourced reservoir. So you can think of it as self-sourced. You can think of it as a conventional reservoir that's externally sourced and storing hydrocarbons, or a hybrid where there may be externally sourced and self-sourced hydrocarbons in the Austin. Regardless of how you think about the Austin and what type of reservoir you want to consider it to be, we believe that the improved understanding of structural and geomechanical characteristics of the Austin chalk will lead to better well planning and stimulation design. And so that's kind of the premise of this work. Another observation I want to make is that the work that I'm going to be showing is outcrop based. And in the subsurface, geologists and geophysicists are typically dealing with seismic reflection data, sometimes induced seismicity data. Often this is a very coarse scale compared to the scale of the wellbore, and compared especially to the stage of the scale of a frac stage. So the volume of rock that might be stimulated by hydraulic fracturing, and also the volume of rock that's being drawn from by a well. On the other end of the spectrum, subsurface, we often have very detailed information, a very refined geophysical log suite from a borehole. Sometimes there's core, and we can have detailed core analysis from that borehole. And that's actually too small to be truly representative of the volume that is being stimulated and drawn from during production. And so what we found is that this intermediate scale is perfectly represented by what we call the outcrop scale. We can go to an outcrop. Some of our outcrops are a mile long. So we can go look at an outcrop in the Eagle Ford, for example. It's a mile long. That it is the length of the common lateral in the Eagle Ford. We can see over that scale of distance, the spacing of features and the kind of the volumetric influence of these features surrounding that wellbore scale. And so it's very, very enlightening to actually go and see structures at this scale, and in fact the layering, the slump folding, and other deformation features you might see in an outcrop. Well, the study area for this presentation is really focused on the outcrop belt of the Austin chalk. Using my mouse to point, and hopefully you can see that. The blue color that's showing up on here is the Austin chalk outcrop belt. So you can see it is through the Waco area, comes down through Austin, San Antonio, out through Uvalde, south of Del Rio, continues into Mexico. It also shows up further west out near Langtree, and in fact into Big Bend National Park area, where it's not mapped as Austin chalk per se, but it is the San Vicente member of the Boquillas Formation. So there's a lot of rock to go see in outcrop. The outcrops around Del Rio and around San Antonio are really not that far up dip, maybe only be 30 kilometers up dip from Eagle Ford production. And remember, the Eagle Ford is considered by many as the source rock for Austin chalk oil or hydrocarbons. So we're going to be looking at examples from this. The first focus area is going to be this black box around San Antonio. And then we're going to look at some examples out near Del Rio and the Langtree area. I want to note that the hydrocarbon zonation here in the Eagle Ford shows gas at the down dip or southeastern edge and grading up into oil at its up dip edge. It's affected by Gulf of Mexico faulting, extension towards the southeast into the Gulf of Mexico. You can see this Edwards and Sligo shelf margin system coming through that affects the Eagle Ford and the Austin Chalk. We also have this black dashed line that represents the laramide macrostructural front. And it's a contractional orogenic belt responding to northeast directed shortening that started in the late Cretaceous and into the early Tertiary, and produced some large-scale structures like the Chittamatic line, as well as small-scale deformation. So the western part of the Eagle Ford play and the Austin Chalk play is affected by laramide deformation, and in fact, all of it is also affected by this extensional deformation representing extension towards the Gulf of Mexico to the southeast. So with that is set up, this is a northwest to southeast seismic profile from a global geophysical 3D survey. And what we can see is that there is this extensional faulting, normal faults. Some of them root down into salt. You can see this Jurassic salt here with listric faults that are rooting down into that. Most of them are dipping towards the southeast, but there's the occasional counter-regional northwest dipping fault. You can see what appears to be a double rollover here with crustal faulting in it. Notice that some of the faults terminate upwards. Really, none of the faults that root into salt continue up through the entire section. There are a lot of normal faults that tend to be controlled by large-scale mechanical stratigraphy. So some zones like the Olmos sands, for example, tend to be more faulted. The Butte, the Eagle Ford, the Austin Chalk, that section has some faults, and so the horizontal wells or laterals tend to be drilled kind of in the plane of the section in the northwest southeast direction, and they try to stay in zone within the Austin Chalk, which sits right above the Eagle Ford. And of course, in the Eagle Ford, they also try to stay in zone in that northwest southeast direction, avoiding the faults. And that we'll get back to that point in a few minutes. So these rocks are not undeformed. They show a homoclinal dip towards the southeast, but they are cut by faults. And these faults, we consider them fractures. They're really the largest fractures in the fracture network. So they're really the tip of the iceberg. That if you can see faults on seismic, then they represent that there are probably a multitude of smaller faults and perhaps extension fractures present in the rock. And so that kind of sets the stage a little bit. Mechanical stratigraphy is also super important. This is an outcrop. We call it the Sycamore Bluffs exposure. It's very near the Rio Grande, southeast of Del Rio, Texas. You can see the contact between the Austin Chalk and the Eagle Ford formation. The Eagle Ford is made up of, people often call it shale, but it's mud rock, it's chalk, limestone, volcanic ash. And in fact, all these lithologies also show up in the Austin Chalk. It's called the Austin Chalk, and in places it's dominated by chalk, but it also has these other components. It just tends to be much more chalk and limestone dominated. So it is much more competent overall than the Eagle Ford, but it still has these mud rock beds and volcanic ash beds that are critical to fracture propagation. So when we think about mechanical stratigraphy, we're thinking about the mechanical properties of the rock. So this is different than lithostratigraphy. It's very sensitive to the mechanical properties of the rock, and in carbonate and mud rock facies, that is very sensitive to the amount of clay. So clay and organic carbon tend to weaken it, and so if it has a little bit of clay, 10 to 15% clay can make an otherwise relatively strong rock relatively weak. The thickness of mechanical layers is also a super important parameter. It often influences fracture height, fault geometry, and so forth. And then the frictional properties of layer interfaces is also important, because a little bit of slip on layer interfaces can stifle vertical fracture propagation. So here's an outcrop of Austin Chalk out near Langtree, Texas, out west. You can see it's relatively thickly bedded. These beds are generally less than a meter thick. You can see blast holes. You can see where they drilled boreholes and blasted this outcrop. And even though they have blasted it, there are precious few vertical opening mode fractures in this outcrop. It's relatively unfractured, with the exception of some there's a tall fracture that's dipping towards the east here, and a tall fracture dipping towards the west here. These are actually both faults. This one has about 30 centimeters of displacement on it, and this fracture has about a couple centimeters of displacement. Very little displacement, but that allows the fracture to propagate up across all these mechanical layers. It's mostly chalk. It's 98% chalk or something like that, maybe 95%. But it's got these mud rock interbeds that are thin, but they're able to arrest the vertical propagation of fractures. So thickly bedded, heterolithic, but chalk dominated. All right, another general concept that is crucial here is failure mode. So people often talk about fractures, and sometimes they may differentiate between opening mode fractures or mode 1 fractures and shear fractures, and those would be mode 2 and mode 3. In reality, that does not really represent the spectrum of failure modes in rock. That doesn't represent failure modes we see in outcrop. It also doesn't represent failure modes that are reproduced in laboratory tests of rock. And so this diagram really summarizes that concept, that we have a more circle plot here with a failure envelope that represents a bunch of failure tests at the point of failure. So we've got a small, more circle here that represents tensile sigma 3 or minimum principal stress, and a slightly compressive sigma 1 or maximum principal stress in a normal faulting regime. So we're getting a relatively small differential stress. It's failing in tension, and so we get a tensile fracture. And these tensile fractures, we generally think of them as forming at 90 degrees to the minimum principal stress, or sigma 3. The other type of fractures that you often hear about are shear fractures, and they tend to form in an oblique angle to sigma 1, and that angle is often thought of as 30 degrees. So we'd have a 60-degree shear fracture or 60-degree dipping fault. And so that would summarize fractures in that kind of mode 1, mode 2 spectrum. But in reality, there is a transitional mode called hybrid that represents the transition between tensile and shear. The overall failure surface will tend to be at a lower than 30-degree angle to sigma 1, and commonly this is anywhere from 1 or 2 degrees to 10 or 15 degrees, something like that. And it's not a simple planar fracture. It's actually a mosaic or a composite. Little segments that are representing tensile failure and little segments that are representing shear failure. And they're beautiful experiments done by Jake Ramsey and Fred Chester in a paper they published in Nature in 2004 that really replicated this in Carrara marble. And then Jennifer Bobbich, in her master's thesis, repeated that work for the Berea sandstone and really showed experimental production of hybrid failure like no one had ever done before, and really proved that this is a mechanism that occurs. And in fact, we do see a lot of evidence of it in the field. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have this failure under even higher mean stress conditions, compactive shear and compactive failure. And you can see as you go to very high stress conditions, you can start to compact the rock. This could be crushing of grains, pore collapse, pressure solution is often involved. And so we've got then a spectrum of deformation mechanisms, but they include tensile fractures that tend to be perpendicular to sigma 3. hybrid that are at a very steep angle, but not quite perpendicular to sigma 3. Then shear fractures. Compactive shear now is at a low angle to sigma 3 and almost perpendicular to sigma 1. And then these horizontal compactive failure surfaces that are in fact perpendicular to sigma 1. In experiments or in nature, we think of a stress condition that may be represented by a Mohr circle, not at the point of failure. So we might have a Mohr circle, sitting in here at under compressive sigma 1 and sigma 3 conditions. And to hydraulically fracture, you crank up the pore fluid pressure, and it essentially drives that Mohr circle to the left until it intersects the failure envelope. So we might get tensile failure, we might get hybrid, we might get shear. This is sensitive to the stress conditions and rock properties at the time. On the other end of the spectrum, there's the same Mohr circle sitting out here in compressive failure space. Decreasing pore fluid pressure will in fact drive you to the right, and so that is the case in a lot of under-consolidated chalk and sandstone reservoirs, where in fact operators often refer to compaction drive. This compaction of the rock helps keep reservoir pressures up and assist in production, but in some cases that deformation is severing production tubing and well bores, and we're getting compactive shear failure, for example. It's offsetting our production tubing. So I want to just point out that these are failure modes that we see in the laboratory, we see them in nature, and we also see that man-made or human-induced processes of oil production and reservoir stimulation can produce, in fact, all these failure modes. And so these outcrop analogs can be thought of in a lot of different ways, and I like to think of them in some cases as analogs for deformation that is being done by operators in the subsurface. All right, so with all that as kind of setup and background, we're going to look at this area around San Antonio, our home, and the Austin Chalk outcrop belt here. Really here we're focusing on essentially reconnaissance level investigation. Sometimes we'll go and hunker down on an outcrop and spend weeks on one outcrop or even more, with a bunch of laboratory studies. We did a relatively quick internal research project just to do a survey of natural fracturing in the San Antonio area. And as background, there's a lot of literature that says there are two fracture sets in the Austin Chalk in the Balcones fault zone, and one strikes northeast, and the other one is orthogonal to that and striking northwest. And that tends to be shown in a lot of maps as very consistent pattern. And we're not far up dip. We're as close as you can get to a lot of the very active Austin Chalk production down in the Carnes Trough region and that area southeast of San Antonio. So we think of these as important analogs for fracture networks that we can use as a guide to understand fracturing within the productive play. All right, so zooming in a little bit more on that. There's lots of outcrops. Actually, one of the most important things to note about this slide is there's a lot of Austin Chalk outcrop indicated by this blue color on this map. Some of this is road cuts, and actually a lot of it is along greenways. We've got this Leon Creek coming through. There's a lot of Austin Chalk along the Leon Creek Greenway. There's a lot of chalk along Culebra Creek. So we've got a lot of creek bed exposure. Some of these are quite long, where you can stay in the Austin Chalk for more than a mile and see essentially continuous outcrop. And we do see that there tends to be a dominant northeast striking set and an orthogonal northwest set. But that's not consistent everywhere. We can see a fair amount of rotation. We can see fractures in other orientations. This is just opening mode or extension fractures. We also see very different character of these fractures. Some are what appear to be barren joints with no discoloration or mineralization in the field. Here's an example of a barren joint, and then a few centimeters away, a fracture that's been enhanced by dissolution. So we've got, buggy or cavernous porosity that's quite large. Here's an example of an extension fracture with over 2 centimeters of calcite vein cement in it. And then there's another example from nearby where we see iron oxide mineralization along one fracture, and then this bleached wall rock that might be related to, instead of an oxidizing fluid, a reducing fluid moving through the rock. So we've got, some clear evidence of these fractures being not just inert features, but important fluid pathways over geologic time. Okay. Another important point that I hinted at earlier, and we see it really well, this is in the Culebra Creek outcrop, where we did a really long scan line to sample the fracture network. This is a Schmidt rebound profile. Basically, weak rock would plot to the left, and strong rock plots to the right. And so we've got this rebound profiles showing overall mostly relatively strong Austin chalk, but we've got these weak beds that show very low rebound, which correlates to very low Young's modulus. And here you can see a fracture that breaks the entire mechanical unit in this bench cut exposure, and then it actually bends and may actually bifurcate here, and then it tips in this thin, less than 10 centimeter thick, it's about 5 centimeter thick mud rock. It's just a very similar looking rock, but a little bit more clay. And that tensile or opening mode fracture is stopped at that mud rock bed and doesn't make it across. And here's another example, the same 5 centimeter thick mud rock terminates this fracture. And that fracture, which I was going to say bifurcate, but it multifurcates. I don't even know if that's a word, but it furcates for sure. And then we've got another fracture coming down. All these fractures are all stopping at that very thin, clay-rich mud rock. All right, so other aspects, we tend to see this dominant set. It tends to parallel the Balcones fault zone, this northeast-southwest direction. It does bend around with the overall bend of the faults. And it's perhaps this joint set is one of the primary reasons that the drillers often drill in the orthogonal northwest-southeast direction, trying to encounter as many. It's really one of two things. We're either trying to encounter these fractures, which may store hydrocarbons and may, more importantly, deliver hydrocarbons to the wellbore. But given that we're still in a normal faulting stress regime in that part of South Texas, fracking may actually generate fractures like these. And so that might be taking advantage of the present day stress field, trying to induce hydraulic fractures that may look fairly similar to these that we see. We zoom in on this example, we see this dominant orientation, the secondary orientation, and these second set of joints are interpreted as coming second because they tend to abut those regional northeast striking joints. So in many cases, that's a very clear relative timing relationship. The fracture network, though, is not represented entirely by opening mode fractures. We also see lots of faults. They're not as abundant as the opening mode fractures, but you can see from the rows diagrams here that we see quite a few faults and in quite a few different orientations. And that is actually true of the larger scale fault network. You see kind of a dominant northeast southwest. It's really more like north 50 degrees or north 55 degrees east dominant trend. But we also see faults that are close to east-west in here. See these? We've got quite a few faults that are very close to east-west, and in fact, that's pretty close to east-west. So faults are seismic scale or map scale in a lot of cases, but in outcrop we're seeing many smaller faults, ones that wouldn't show up except because of quarrying or some other natural erosion in a creek bed or something like that. These would be faults that have often less than a meter of displacement on them. Here's one at what was the former Longhorn Quarry, where you can see really nice slicken lines that actually change their inclination down the fault plane. You see multiple slip surface here. This is at the Culebra Creek exposure, and another one at the Culebra Creek, Lotus Creek confluence. And this is actually filled with calcite. And you can see slicken lines tracking the slip direction, but there's a lens of calcite in here. When we see these in sort of more three-dimensional or cross-section view, what we can see is that we often have shear displacement linking to hybrid failure. So actually refraction of the fault related to this hybrid behavior, so that the fault becomes very steep through parts of the section. And when it was nucleating and slipping, it was both, there was both shear and dilation occurring, which opens up conduits that are elongate parallel to the fault bedding intersection direction, and in this case, mineralize with calcite. So clearly, and this is a fault that's got just a few centimeters of displacement on it. Clearly, it was a fluid pathway. All right, and stepping back to the larger scale, I want to make a note about this kind of larger context of this North San Antonio area, that we're in an area where the dominant faults that make up the Balcones fault zone. This is the Balcones escarpment fault up New Braunfels that Comal Springs emerged from to form a Comal River here. And then that fault's actually dying out into San Antonio. It's actually tips out here, and another important fault with very similar several hundred meters of displacement starts here, and it's building displacement towards the southwest. And so we've got a relay in here where displacement is being transferred from this one major fault to the next. This is called the San Antonio relay ramp. I think that term was coined by Eddie Collins. And basically the regional fault pattern is really reflecting that extension direction towards the southeast. Well, that relay starts to develop, so we're getting a panel of rock that's tilting towards the south a little bit. The bounding faults are propagating through time, or trying to, and so you wind up with this curved lateral propagation pathway that shows this kind of east-west orientation of faults. And it's not just one fault, it's a bunch of faults that strike east-west in here that are pretty unique to this relay ramp position. And so you get a local or perturbed stress field in this relay where you get a different fault pattern than you do elsewhere that's right near one of the main displacement portions of the fault. Where we don't have a relay, you tend to have these more consistent fault orientation. So the relay ramp is actually kind of a unique spot, because we have the kind of the regional orientation that the rock's feeling first, and then this perturbed stress field as the relay ramp starts to develop, where you get a second orientation of faults coming in here. We've seen these at many scales. Many of you have been to Canyon Lake Gorge with us on field trips, and we've seen very small scale examples of this. And this is a large scale example where we're talking about a relay ramp that's about 10 kilometers wide. This is, the kind of the scale of structure that you could see with seismic down in the Austin Chalk Play or the Eagleford Play. And in preparing for this talk, I remembered that a while back in 1998, we actually drew a little diagram to illustrate this point. We were working in offshore Vietnam for a client who was having a lot of problems finding good fracture permeability in a fractured basement reservoir in offshore Vietnam. And we were trying to convince them that really the fault system is explaining your best fracture permeability. In fact, relay ramps are places where you're getting your very best production, and you should think about drilling directionally to, within these ramps, and try to encounter more of these fractures. They would only drill vertical wells at the time. I learned later that they changed their approach and did directional drilling and focused on relays, and that became their very successful production model. This is from a presentation I gave at a Texas Railroad Commission technology workshop in 1998, and I just dug it out a couple of days ago to put in here. We have had a number of clients that took our field trips and field seminars and went back and drew directionally Eagleford wells to stay within relay ramps, to stay within zones, obviously not exactly like this geometry, but taking advantage of this very concept to drill some extremely successful Eagleford wells, and it pertains to the Austin Chalk just equally, maybe even more so, where you're relying more on that, perhaps a natural fracture network. a great opportunity to take advantage of a little sliver of rock that might not be wide enough to drill in zone in your regional orientation, but you could turn 90 degrees to that and get some great wells stuck in those relay structures. Well, anyway, from the first summary that I want to touch on here is that we do see in outcrop significant variability in the fracture network in terms of failure modes. We see tensile, hybrid, shear, fracture orientations. Incompetent beds in the Austin Chalk tend to cause opening mode fractures or extension fractures to terminate. They also commonly cause faults to refract, and so we see that in outcrop quite often. The fracture network characteristics do reflect mechanical rock properties as well as structural position. So there is quite a bit of variability. A lot of it relates to the seismic scale structural position, and to some extent is predictable, like this relay ramp model we've got here on the right. And in fact, we think that provides a really important specific production drilling target. That structural position is worth thinking about if you have that kind of structural architecture in your Austin Chalk acreage. And regardless of whether you are trying to take advantage of natural fractures or hydraulic fracturing, these concepts are pretty important to try to inform a conceptual model that then can be a guide in planning your production. Okay, I know we're running short on time, but I'm going to crank on through these additional segments. We're now going to tunnel into some Austin Chalk faults. We've now seen that faults can be the largest fractures in the fracture network. We looked at a number of examples in Outcrop, and these are all faults that are less than a meter throw. So they are in the Austin Chalk outcrop belt. They're, as you saw, quite a ways up dip from maturation of Austin Chalk or Eagle Ford as source rock or for self-sourced reservoir. From the associated Eagle Ford source rock, mud rock in the region, we see everything is immature. The only data point we have that shows oil window conditions when we do a source rock analysis is way further west out in Big Bend National Park. So these are rocks that are definitely under mature. We look at this example. This is at Pinto Creek, to southeast of Del Rio, pretty close to Eagle Ford and Austin Chalk production. We can see a chalk-dominated section of Austin Chalk. Again, no opening mode fractures that are breaking. You see a few that break individual beds, but none of those make it with significant height through the outcrop. But there is one fault shown, or one fracture shown here that does cut the entire height of the outcrop, and it's one we called the leaf cutter fault, because when we were sampling for our fluid inclusion analyses, sampling veins, we saw a train of leaf cutter ants walking right up the fault plane. The fault has less than a meter of normal displacement. It does show, although when you're standing back, you don't necessarily see it. It shows a number of little wiggles that reflect refraction through the mechanical layers. And you see it, and when you zoom in, you can see in more detail. Rock hammer for scale here, and it's got about 35 centimeters, or no, more like a half a meter displacement on it. We can see that the failure surface is not planar at all. It's not just a planar, shear fracture, but it's refracting through the rock section here. So we sampled vein calcite from a number of these veins. We did fluid inclusion analyses on these. So we see that there are quite a few two-phase aqueous inclusions. They actually allow us to estimate from homogenization temperatures, the depth at the time of formation, and these from these faults and others in the nearby, anywhere from 1.5 kilometers to around 4 kilometers of overburden at the time. So these were forming at depths very similar to where a lot of Eagle Ford and Austin Chalk drilling and production is going on right now. We also see ubiquitous fluorescent oil inclusions, and so these are, C and D, E and F. These are companion photos under plain polarized light, and then under UV fluorescence. And so you can see these fluorescing hydrocarbon inclusions. On the plot on the right, we're using the color spectrum from those oil inclusions to estimate their API gravity. And what we see is we're seeing in the dark triangles and squares are these Austin chalk oils from these veins. And you see they're anywhere from about 35 to 50 API gravity. The circles on here are Eagleford oils that we sampled nearby as well. So even though the rocks are under mature, we're seeing clear and ubiquitous evidence that these small displacement faults were fluid pathways and had hydrocarbons migrating along them. So second summary point slide here is that faults are commonly the largest fracture networks in the overall, or faults are the largest fractures in the network. They often are refracted and dilational and self-propping, and so they are important fluid movement pathways. We do see crack sealed textures, and we see evidence of their formation at depths of, for the most part, 1.4 to 2.9 kilometers of depth. Sometimes a few examples were up to 4.2 kilometers. Estimates, that seems too high to us, but anyway, 1.5 to 3 kilometers of overburden, which is, you know, 1 to about 2 miles of depth at the time, and similar to where a lot of hydraulic stimulation is going on. And we think, in fact, that these may be representative of some of the hydraulic fractures. They may be actually inducing hybrid failure and refracted fault surfaces as induced fractures. The fluids include locally sourced saline waters and externally sourced waters, but very importantly, they also include oil in rocks that did not reach oil maturation conditions. So these were migration pathways for oil. As I noted, we see 30 to 50 API oil, and we don't, in fact, see opening mode fractures very commonly in these same outcrops. They tend to be bed restricted. They tend to also not commonly have vein material along them. So we see this is unique to the faults, that they are very important as migration pathways. Okay, in the final section here, delving into that fault in a little bit more detail, and digging into that refraction, we can observe from mesostructure characteristics in the field evidence of shear failure, hybrid, compactive shear along this single fault. So, and you can also see that we're seeing shear more in the competent, or in some of the mud rock, the calcareous mud rock beds. We see hybrid often through the more competent chalk beds, and then compactive shear only in the weakest clay-rich beds, typically. Here we're going to look at this slightly differently. We're going to talk about it in terms of the orientation of those surfaces within the stress field at the time, and a couple concepts that we're familiar with. Dilation tendency, which comes from work we did back in 1999 or before. It's really a normalized parameter showing with respect to the normal stress acting on a fracture plane. So this really enhances the observation the fractures that are perpendicular to sigma 3 are more likely to be open than ones that are normal to sigma 1. Slip tendency is focused on the ratio of shear stress to normal stress. And what we see when we go look at that leaf cutter fault is that dilation tendency color scheme here on the left. This profile shows the dilation tendency on the right. We see the slip tendency color scale, slip tendency plot. And so notice that slip and dilation tendency are changing quite dramatically along this fault, which was, you know, active at one point in time. A graph on the right shows slip tendency in blue, and so you can see the slip tendency is varying along the height of that fault. Dilation tendency in red, and so we can see patches that where we have this field observation of shear deformation tends to have the highest slip tendencies, the blue, and more moderate dilation tendencies. When we look at the hybrid segments, we see evidence of both shear and dilation at the time of activity. They tend to have very low slip tendency. So low slip tendency, very high dilation tendency. And then the place that we're seeing compactive shear, we see very low slip tendency and low dilation tendency. So this is actually really interesting, because if we have the geometry, we feel like we can apply an interpretive stress tensor and predict the failure mode using this combined slip and dilation tendency analysis. It seems to work very well for some of these faults that we've been looking at in the field, and so now we're excited about people using it predictively. When we plot the slip tendency versus dilation tendency, then we see a pattern of data that captures tensile, hybrid, shear, compactive shear, and compactive failure. Tensile and hybrid we think of as volume enhancing processes. Shear as a volume neutral, and the compactive shear and compactive failure as volume loss mechanisms. And so then if we think this through, then we can use this for predicting fracture permeability. We can use it in fault seal analysis. If we're thinking about trying to avoid drilling hazards, circulation loss or mud loss of faults, we could use this, say, I really want to cross a fault in a zone like this where volume loss is more likely, and I want to avoid places like this. These faults that have this kind of behavior are likely to be leakage pathways or connect to other aquifers, may cause frac hits on other wells, and so I think there are a lot of applications of this concept. And on the right, now we see the color. These are points from a single three-dimensional fault plane that we mapped, color-coded by dip, and we can see that we actually see all these behaviors along an individual kind of outcrop scale fault. And so, to summarize this, then the identification of deformation modes for initial failure or fault reactivation is directly relevant to whether we have a volume gain, a porosity increase or decrease. We think that this approach can be used for prediction of failure modes, failure behavior, and relevance to fluid migration. Importantly, it is applicable to faults and fractures at any scale and in any stress regime. We're talking about a normal faulting regime here, but it's also directly relevant to strike slip and truss faulting regimes in any stress regime. But it does require a detailed analysis of fault and fractures, and if you're using it on like seismic scale faults, the detail does matter. Very careful mapping is critical. Well, thank you all for your time and attention. As I said, this really is like a survey of some of the observations from a number of different papers cited here, and I don't have to rush off. If people want to stick around and have some questions, I'd be glad to participate. Thank you all.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. Great presentation, great diagrams. If we were in person, I would stand up and give you a standing ovation.
Thank you.
There are some questions that came through in the chat and on the Q&A session. Would it be easier if I read those to you, or are you able to see those on your end?
How about if I minimize this, or maybe I should I stop sharing? I don't know. I need to be able to see the rest of the screen, I guess. Okay, I can see chat now.
Okay. I think the first question was from Gary Prost. He asked, how representative of the subsurface is the surface? Do you think all structures seen at the surface chalk outcrops also exist at depth?
That's a fantastic question. We deal with that question all the time, and there are people that think that I'm looking at that road cut and we don't see that in the subsurface, and we've heard that time and time again. So we've gone to extensive effort to explore that. And that's actually the reason we started doing the fluid inclusion work. It's like, okay, well, we've got these faults. we've been told we don't have these down in the reservoir. So I want to know, is this something that formed at this ground surface or near the ground surface, or did it form at the kind of depth that the reservoir is currently at or has been at? And in general, all the stuff I presented here, I believe to be directly relevant to what is in the reservoir. And the other, support for that is after we've taken people from our consortium projects or field trips, often it's an Austin Chalk team or an Eagle Ford team. They will go back, they'll go see the stuff in the field, we'll have the same discussion, and they will go back and they'll say, you know what, we do have that. We said we didn't have that. We said we didn't have beef. We said we didn't have folds. We said we didn't have small faults. We said we didn't have closely spaced extension fractures, but we collected a horizontal core or a horizontal image log, or we actually went and looked at the core in our warehouse, which nobody had actually done. All these things, and it's there. It is there. So we, one of the things we always do is triage on the outcrop. Like, I really hate studying extension fractures in blasted outcrops, because every single fracture you have to question, is that a natural or induced fractures? If it's got a vein, if it's got iron oxide discoloration or something like that, that might tell you it's older than the outcrop, and that can be useful. But a lot of our work, we wind up doing our really detailed hunker down work on natural exposure. So we can say, well, it didn't necessarily form deep, but it definitely formed naturally. And that's a great concept. Like, I don't have to worry about blasting and that kind of thing. So that's where we tended to do most of the really detailed work. There are certainly, I want to make this point important. It's a very important point, that there are certainly fractures that did not form at maximum burial, but formed during exhumation and unloading. A lot of people, I think, hear those words and think weathering and think at the ground surface. And that's not what I mean. That when you have buried the rock to maximum burial and start removing overburden, you're decompressing it a little bit. And it's been long, well understood that you can remove a little bit of overburden. It might be 1,000 feet or a few thousand feet, and it can start a fracture generation episode. And this is especially true in a rock that is overpressured, or it is at the maximum pore pressure it can withstand. As soon as you start removing overburden, that containment is released and you start to frack it. And so I think a lot of the fractures that we see in outcrop are, especially like that late generation of opening mode fractures, formed perhaps during unloading, but at significant depth. And is that relevant to the reservoirs? Yes. Every Austin Chalk well that's ever been drilled was in rock that was not at maximum burial. It has been exhumed some amount. Some of it's been exhumed all the way to the ground surface, of course, while we have outcrop, but all of it is no longer at maximum burial. It's experienced some overburden removal. And so, I think there are just tons of lessons here. Obviously, things won't be identical in the subsurface, but I think every concept that I talked about and presented is directly relevant to what's really in the Austin Chalk and other reservoirs at depth.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a great response. The next is kind of a question or comment. It says, drilling in relay ramps is successful in geothermal for the same reasons, correct? And that popped up whenever you showed that diagram of that well that kind of drilled right through that relay ramp.
Right. That's a great, I mean, I know that, and it's great to have that pointed out. I'm not sure how much has been published, but I know from some of the work in geothermal fields out in Nevada and California that we've heard that, and Jim Faulds and his team have told us that previously.
Awesome. Another question, how does the Austin Chalk compare to the chalk in the UK/North France in terms of lithostratigraphy and lithomechanics? I'm no expert on those chalks. It is a relatively
strong material. It is, it's rather complicated. A lot of the Austin chalk is not really chalk, it's limestone. It is fairly dense compared with a lot of chalks. It is way more consolidated and dense and lower porosity than a lot of North Sea chalks. Think of like Echo Fisk Field, where they have had huge amounts of compaction during production because it was so under consolidated. In fact, I think they had to spend like $1 billion elevating the entire multi-platform production facility because it was subsiding down into the waves. And so, the chalks are not by any means all created equal. So, yeah, I think I'll stop there. I know that there, like some of the chalks, there's a wide spectrum. Some of the chalks I've seen in the UK, I think Lulworth Cove shows significant porosity change related to deformation position. So I think that's probably a relatively porous and low density chalk compared with the Austin.
Awesome. Thank you. We have 2 questions from Steve Naruk. First is, do you see damage zones along the faults? And then second question is, when did the fluid inclusions form relative to the burial history?
Okay. So yeah, this question about damage zones along faults is tricky. There are not a lot of great Austin chalk fault zone exposures that we've seen that are like seismic scale, and I don't know if that's what Steve is thinking of. I know there are a number of them. They do show some damage zone. A critical point that I want to make is that none of the faults that we're looking at here, these sub-meter displacement faults, none of them have like a significant damage zone around them. And they're all nucleating, I would say, in the Austin chalk and within individual beds in the Austin chalk and propagating, within that formation. However, we do see other faults, and this is something you can definitely see at the seismic scale, that did not nucleate in the Austin, but propagated into it from either above or below. And what we've found from our outcrop work, and this is more formation scale behaviors, that if a fault nucleates, for example, in the Edwards limestone beneath, or the Georgetown, and it propagates up through the section, it's got to make it through the Del Rio clay and the Butte limestone and the Eagle Ford. And the Del Rio clay and the Eagle Ford are in places weak enough that they absorb that displacement, and it leads to fault tip folding or fault propagation folding. So you can be folding the Austin chalk ahead of the fault tip. And so when the fault ultimately breaks through that formation, it's already been folded. It's got an anticlinal hinge or axial surface. It's got a synclinal axial surface. It's got a dipping panel in between that will be more fractured than the surrounding rock. And if there's more than one fault involved, it's likely to have a relay ramp with, again, local fracture network development there. So the damage zone then is something we do see in the Austin, or evidence of. After presenting these concepts, we've been presented on a proprietary basis, been shown by a number of different operators, great examples in different formations, including the Austin chalk, of the same sort of fault tip folding process in a damage zone. It's quite complicated, and that is predictable with respect to the seismic scale structure. We're not going to get into this in detail, but I also want to note that it really matters. The geometry of that damage zone is strongly influenced by where that fault nucleates. So if it nucleated, if we're talking Austin chalk, if it nucleated below the Austin, say in the Edwards or the Glen Rose, and it's propagating upwards, we'll get that fault tip fold that gets, many people call it a fault propagation fold. I like to call it a fault tip fold or a fault non-propagation fold, because the fold's not there because the fault was propagating. The fold's there because the fault stopped propagating and kept slipping, and that produced the folding. So this fold develops, and it will, for this upwardly propagating fault through the Austin, it will wind up producing a wide and more complex hanging wall damage zone. If, on the other hand, the fault nucleated above the Austin, say up in those Olmo sands, for example, and propagated downwards into the Austin, it'll also cause fault tip folding. It will ultimately result in a footwall damage zone that's much more complicated and intensely deformed than the hanging wall. So that polarity is strongly influenced by where the fault nucleated, which way it was propagating, and it's not necessarily likely to be symmetrical. We don't, for those faults that are kind of seismic scale and started elsewhere and broke into that formation, it may be highly biased towards one side of the fault or the other, and in a predictable way, something you can predict from the seismic.
Yeah.
Steve had another question about the timing of fluids with respect to burial history. That's actually, I'm not sure I'm really equipped to answer that right now. We, we've been doing similar studies in like the Permian Basin. We've done some in our consortium work in the Eagle Ford, where we have like modern downhole temperature. We know what oil chemistry is or API is. We can compare directly with that kind of information and put things in a relative position in terms of timing. I think these faults were probably active. I mean, based on those homogenization temperatures, I think they were probably pretty near maximum burial when they, these are outcrops where these estimates from homogenization temperature would put us pretty near the maximum burial that is independently assessed for these rocks. So I think they were probably near maximum burial. And that would also make sense from just the maturation, conditions of the Eagle Ford or Austin Chalk source rock down dip that might be charging, producing the hydrocarbons that are showing up in our inclusions.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question. Are these refractions and faults also associated with local fluid overpressures? Would centimeter scale overpressure be a controlling factor based on your outcrop observations?
In general, the refraction makes sense in a single. I'm not exactly sure how to interpret that question, but I mean, certainly pore pressure is critical at whatever scale. I mean, the rock is fracturing at a centimeter scale, so I mean, that's at the scale of the fracture as it's propagating, it's feeling local stress driven by things at that scale, the scale of centimeters. So whatever's going on at that scale is very directly relevant to the formation, the propagation of the fracture, I would say. I kind of wonder if there's not a stress perturbation part of that same question, and these faults that we're talking about actually make very good sense as initiating all in a fairly consistent, stress field at the time without invoking any kind of stress rotation. We do see evidence. I mean, I want to say we do see evidence of stress rotation in relay structures, and we see that in map view, and we also see it in profile view. So some faults that we've looked at show vertical segmentation, where we have a relay that's shown in cross section, and that we definitely see rotation of the orientations of the shear, hybrid, and tensile segments of the fault in that local zone. But once we get out of that, they seem to be pretty consistent with a regional, stress condition. I think historically, when we're talking about refracted faults and dilational jogs on faults and things like that, some people have, there are quite a few papers that talk about forming one set like often you'll see they interpret that the opening mode fractures, there were kind of distributed opening mode fractures that formed first, and then shear fractures formed to link up some of those segments. And I don't doubt that that happens, but it's not what happened in the rocks we're looking at, because we don't, in a lot of these rocks, we don't see opening fractures except as parts of these faults. You know, we're seeing what appears to be a hybrid segment of the fault. So the forming, you know, as these complex multi-mode composites.
Awesome. Awesome. A question from Tom Turek. Do you have a rule of thumb for porosity in Austin chalk fractures versus matrix?
I don't. Low, well, I think they're probably both low. I mean, the fractures volumetrically are generally probably, you know, one of the problems is we can't measure a meaningful aperture from a joint that's meaningful to what it would really be at reservoir depth. So, I mean, you know, you might see a millimeter in the outcrop, but it might have been a tenth or a hundredth of a millimeter or less in the subsurface. I mean, that's in composite. The volume is probably, you know, 1% or less, I would say, for the kind of fracture networks we've seen. I mean, they're not extremely heavily fractured. Even if you kind of look at the minus cement porosity for a vein network, we're still talking about pretty low volumes. We've seen swarms of veins in the Austin chalk equivalent San Vicente member of the Boquillas Formation, for example, out at Ernst Tanaja and Big Bend National Park, and that might be getting up to several percent volumetrically, or, you know, maybe 5%, maybe 10% or something like that. But that is a different tectonic position. You know, it's rocks that experience strong laramide deformation followed by basin and range extension and cementation. And I don't think that's a great analog for, you know, the Austin chalk in the reservoir from that particular perspective. However, I want to note that they're hugely important. The fractures in general and the faults in particular are very important as fluid movement pathways, I think. And the fact that the faults, even these tiny displacement faults, can break across numerous weak interbeds and produce this kind of connected fracture. The rock can be super low permeability, like in the Eagle Ford. You know, we think about nanodarcy permeabilities, but these faults, even the tight parts of the fault, are more permeable than the host rock. And so we can get fluid moving through mud rock that is, you know, essentially impermeable otherwise, or nanodarcy permeabilities, but be able to work its way along one of these kind of these faults that have high permeability segments, but also very low permeability segments that are still more permeable than the host.
Agreed. All great points. Okay, another good question. Dan says, thanks for the great talk. The influence of relatively thin beds on propagation is amazing. I agree. Given that it appears these layers can have such a big impact on fracture propagation / arrest, do you have any recommendations for the modelers, and possibly what scale do they need to look at?
It's a very good question. My recommendation to the modelers is to become knowledgeable about the mechanical stratigraphy, first of all. I think in a lot of cases, people aren't, you know, so, I mean, what we often see, and things have changed quite a bit in the industry, but what we've seen in a lot of cases is that these well, I'll call them unconventional reservoirs, these self-sourced reservoir plays, or hybrid, you know, in the case of Austin, however you want to think about that. But these resource plays where there's a huge volume of rock that is thought to contain hydrocarbon, and really what we have to go do is industrially just go in and put in a wellbore and frack it. There's an exploration team that comes up with the concept, that decides on the acreage. They go buy the acreage, and then very quickly it gets handed over to the engineers to apply that industrial process to drill and frack and put it online to produce it. And the reality is it's very complicated in that, that target zone, for example, even something as simple as target zone is often drilled or selected based on TOC, basically organic content. They want to hit the highest TOC zone. That might not in reality turn out to be the best zone for several reasons. It may be too ductile and not fracked very well. You might be able to frack it, but when you start putting it on, you prop it and then you put it on production, and then that pore pressure starts dropping and the fractures start closing, and that proppant embeds, and the production pathway represented by fractures is sealed off by fracture closure and embedment of proppant, so that you don't get a good productive well. So we've worked with a number of companies and seen a lot of examples where a better job can be done by first understanding the mechanical stratigraphy in detail, and as part of that, what's the fracture network, because the natural fracture network affects the mechanical properties of the rock today. If you already have a heavily fractured or even a lightly fractured strong layer, it will first of all weaken the layer. It'll tend to reactivate those existing structures instead of breaking new ones in a lot of cases. So anyway, we want to understand the mechanical stratigraphy, and we also want to understand the natural deformation, because it is a direct clue of how the rocks deform, because they've been there before, they've done it before. If you see tensile fractures in chalk and see them tipping into the mud rocks, that can happen in that rock, and you ought to be thinking about whether that happens when you frack. Okay, so when I think about stimulating a well, you pack off an interval, you crank up the pressure. It's overpressured fluid is going out through the perforations into, through the casing and into the surrounding rock, and you have this really high pore pressure gradient that's diminishing outward. So you're driving fractures. The pore pressure generation is extending further and further out. And so what's going on near the wellbore may be quite different than what's going on further out. You've got this radial dampening effect of that spreading pressure front. And so it's very complicated, but if you don't understand the rock and the fact that you may be trying to stimulate across a whole bunch of weak clay-rich mud rocks and ash beds and things like that, they may limit your frac height in the first place, but they're also very likely to limit your retrieval, because each of those really weak zones is a place that fractures may close and embed proppant and get sealed off during production. And so you might see a really dramatic production decline, even though you're able to frac extensively, and your microseismic might tell you that. And when it gets down to production, that mechanical stratigraphy can be key. So, a lot of it's first become aware that this can be important. Now go understand the rocks, and how it is important varies so much place to place. I don't want to, I'd say it's always important, and exactly how it's important varies from location to location, even within a play.
Awesome.
But we've had some really successful trips, geology field trips for mostly engineers, where a company will send their stimulation engineers, their drilling engineers, their reservoir engineers, and then a few geo handlers, just geologists that go along to help relate what we're seeing in the outcrop to what they're dealing with in the subsurface. And they have gone back, enlightened, and changed practices. I mean, simple things like drilling azimuth. It's like, we actually, had companies go back and literally change their paradigm for what direction they're going to drill, because they now understand it better. Others, they've changed zones. They said, you know what, I think we need to move to a more frackable zone that has more competent beds, even though it's got lower TOC, I think we can get a better well, and that works. And so it varies so much play to play and place to place that I think I'll stop there.
Awesome. No, you're great. I think by kind of talking about this, you're answering some of the other questions as well. So I'm trying to think about maybe ones you've already answered. I do have another question. I don't know how much time you have, but this one kind of reminds me of like squeezing an Oreo cookie, but it's from Elena. She says, is it possible to say that horizontal stresses may concentrate on harder chalk intervals and decrease slightly on beds of weaker shales?
Horizontal stresses. Well, yeah, I think, I mean, from a geomechanics, rock mechanics standpoint, I mean, I think a way I want to answer that first is yes, absolutely. That, you know, in the normal faulting regime, the maximum principal stress is the vertical overburden stress. That's the driver, sigma 1. The horizontal response, you know, rocks have different elastic properties, different Poisson's ratios. But they also, and a lot of people think of it just in those kind of terms, and how stiff the rock is and what's this Poisson ratio. But they also have different ductilities. And so a clay-rich bed can ductily deform, and it can compact and thin and attenuate and ductily stretch and accommodate that load, and without developing the differential stress that the overlying and underlying chalk beds will. So the stiffer beds that are less ductile, they might experience like 1% strain, 1 or 2% by ductile, processes, and then they start building up that stress internally and to the point of failure. And so I think the way to think about it is that the rock capability to support a differential stress varies with their mechanical properties. And so through at the formation scale and also at the bed scale, this should lead to stress differences from bed to bed to bed, and how the rock behaves. And so that's really fundamental. Those ductile beds, they don't have the same differential stress in them. They can't support the same differential stress. It'll dictate, so a lot of people think, oh, shales are weak. They're going to fail first. They're going to fault and fracture first. We've heard from, companies, big named service companies that ought to know better that, fractures nucleate in the shales first. But those are the ductile rocks. They tend to be much more difficult to actually brittly fracture than a ductile shale would be.
Awesome. There are a couple questions about how you might measure mechanical stratigraphy using either well logs, other kind of logs, and core. Can you maybe comment on that? And I think that will answer several questions in one.
Okay. So yeah, I'm trying to compose my answer, but so there are lots of, first of all, I want to say that rock mechanical properties are definitely part of mechanical stratigraphy. Remember, we talked about that. What are the mechanical properties of the rocks? What are the thickness of the units? What's the nature of those interfaces between beds? Okay, and those are like three critical components. What we often see is people that take a core will go and maybe for a half dozen locations, and an extreme case might be 20 locations, they'll go and drill out cores and send them to a rock mechanics lab and have analyses done. So there tend to be, it's destructive, so you can't get multiple measurements from one piece of rock. The cores tends to be small, so you can either wind up with these really small cylinders, which tend to be give less reliable results than larger cylinders. So there's just not a lot of repeat analysis done. There's not by that I mean if I went to an outcrop, I might get a 200-pound block and drill 20 cylinders out of it and really understand the mechanical properties of rock. And that's, rock mechanics literature is full of those sorts of analyses, and we just don't have the opportunity to do that from core. So we wind up with spotty information, and then that's just part of the story. It also doesn't capture the bed thickness and the transitions between beds. And so, and another point is that even if they're great measurements, they're representing a very small volume of the rock. And so our approach has been to use a rebound tool, and there's a micro rebound tools called Piccolo hardness testers, or Bambino is one that's less electronic, and those are essentially the same device. They're developed for testing hardness of metals, but they are a non-destructive tool that we can use for core, and shows good calibration against traditional rock mechanical measurements, particularly of unconfined compressive strength and Young's modulus. And so we actually measure the rebound and use it as a proxy for UCS and Young's modulus. And we've actually done quite a bit of work in the last couple of years to further the calibration of that against traditional rock mechanics testing. So that is kind of our mechanical measurement that we use. And with that, we can then go through the core at the inch scale and the 6-inch scale and collect companion data for every core plug location where UCS, Young's modulus, Brazilian tests were done, and where porosity and permeability and TOC were collected, and where all the XRD mineralogy was done. And so we found that actually great correlations often exist between rebound and the XRD mineralogy. And that mineralogy, we believe to be the largest factor in deriving mechanical properties. And so there's just a ton of information that comes out of doing that. And at the same time, we're capturing the thickness of the beds and the nature of the transitions, where they're planar, undulatory, sutured, gradational. There's a lot of information there. And as I said, we want the companion structural data to go with that, which would be basically logging every single natural fault, fracture, stylolite, every natural deformation feature we see in that same context. And then we can say, okay, yeah, we actually do see 10 fractures per inch in this silicious bed in the Woodford, Molly. I mean, incredibly high fracture intensities in charts of the Woodford Formation, for example, and then we'll see none in the mudrock bed right next to it. I mean, you see a lot of things, really detailed relationship between fracture properties and mechanical properties, and that really informs a nice conceptual model, of the natural fracturing. So, that can be done at a very high resolution scale, and I think that's superior to just a bunch of core plug analyses. It's less destructive than scratch test, which is limited and is quite it just provides a very different perspective on things, and can be related to all the other petrophysical observations. So that's one way. That's the way we often go about it. I think still the rebound is a proxy, but really any rock mechanics strength estimate or measurement you make is a proxy, because the core, when you take a core out of the ground and you bring it up from 13,000 feet and it's cooling down and it's probably drying out, and the fluid type may be formation fluids being replaced with the drilling mud or the circulated mud. It's being decompacted, unloaded. Okay, you take it in the lab, you wash it, and whatever happens, you drill out the cores. So the rock that you're measuring in the lab is not will not have the same properties as it would if you could somehow miraculously test it underground, which is impossible. Because anything you do, you drill that borehole, you change the stress conditions and the environmental conditions and the property of the rock. So there's really no way to get a perfect, representative analysis of exactly what is in the reservoir. So everything you do is a proxy. Wireline logs we also use. The couple problems in the Eagle Ford and the Austin Chalk, and in lots of these self-source reservoirs, there are important mechanical beds that are an inch thick, or thin anyway, way thinner than the resolution limit of the sort of smeared out wireline log that's averaging over some distance. The data spacing may be 6 inches, okay, but that measurement at each 6-inch position is a kind of a smeared out analysis over an interval of between source and receiver, some distance of rock. That is actually coarse compared with the scale of mechanical layering that is important to faulting and fracturing. And so, I think when you see a really, highly variable, spiky log signature, and you think, oh, this is interlayered, strong and weak, well, that's super important versus something really blocky, weak shale, or a really strong sandstone or limestone or something like that. I mean, you can definitely get a good estimate, a good proxy for the large scale mechanical stratigraphy from logs, from wireline logs. Even gamma, gamma is picking up on often clay content, and clay is so, it's like the number one mineral in terms of affecting weakness of these sedimentary rocks. That it's a pretty good proxy for that. It's just kind of coarse for the scale of some of the deformation that we see to be important.
Awesome.
Is that a short enough answer? I can go longer, Molly, at any point.
Yeah, that was great. I hope everybody, I hope they're taking notes. Well, this has been wonderful. I don't want to keep you too much longer. I appreciate you staying the extra 40 minutes, and really appreciate you being our first speaker. For those of you that are left on here, our next webinar will be April 21st, and we're going to have Dr. Elena Konstantinovskaya. I promise I will learn how to say your name before our next webinar, but she's a professor at the University of Alberta, and I'm really looking forward to her talk as well. So I hope everyone will join us again here in another month. And David, I just want to say thank you again. Thank you for your time. I hope you're able to see the chat or go to that and see it, because you have a lot of people saying what a wonderful presentation it was, and we really appreciate it as well.
Great. I just finally got that chat window up where I could see all of it. So yeah, thank you so much for all the questions and feedback. I appreciate it, and glad we did this. And I'm really excited about it. When it was proposed, when Ronnie and David called me up, I just thought it was a fantastic idea. I really, like, one of my favorite external interactions that I've had since COVID started was the PSGD annual meeting associated with AAPG. That was just, I felt like that was, visiting with old friends that I hadn't seen in ages. And so I think this will provide a really nice venue for that kind of interaction.
Yeah, I hope so. And I believe we're going to have it in person this year and virtual, at least from what I've heard on my side.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
Look forward to it.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. I'll leave the meeting open for just a couple minutes if you want to read through the chat and any questions. I think if I hit the end meeting button, it'll kick everybody out, including you. So I'll leave it open for just a minute.
Okay. I'm scrolling through them here. And is the recorded presentation going to be online? Did you say that?
Oh yes, I did record this, so I will talk to David Haddad and Ronnie and see where we want to store this. I'm gonna assume YouTube, but whenever that is available, hopefully within the next week or a couple days, I will post it to LinkedIn for sure on our page, and then I'll see if they would like me to send an email with that link as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We'll look forward to the next one.
Yeah, thank you too. I really appreciate it.
Okay. All right. I think I'm ready to check out.
All right. Bye.
All right. Bye.